Hello, and we're here today for an interview with Professor Phil O'Keefe, whose career in academia has spanned over 45 years, and he's spent the last 30 years also involved in humanitarian evaluations. And so we've got a number of questions that we're going to put to Phil today to try and really gain from his experience and his education and the lessons that he's learned over all of these years. So firstly, Phil, can you tell us, how did you get involved in evaluations of humanitarian programs?
I began with the OECD DAC program, the Development Assistance Committee, and they were focused on the evaluation of development programs. So the first very large one we did was a review of Dutch aid in 8 different countries. In my particular case, I had Sudan, where we looked at 12 different projects. And then there was a big evaluation of the World Bank of the energy sector assistance program. What happened, though, was largely by accident in terms of humanitarian assistance. In 1993, the Dutch aid program decided to review its spending in Somalia as a chronic emergency. And that was simultaneously with evaluations launched by CEDA for humanitarian assistance to the whole Horn of Africa. So it was Somalia, Ethiopia, and northern Kenya. But just as these evaluations were taking place, the Rwanda genocide began. And suddenly, we were faced with the task of recognizing that the original questions asked of development aid, namely relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, and most important, sustainability, were perhaps inappropriate to the humanitarian aid evaluation. And so there was an attempt to rewrite, after the Somali mission, for the OECD, new evaluation guidelines for humanitarian assistance. And really, what happened with those new guidelines was a substitution of sustainability from development aid evaluation with the 4 C's: connectedness, coordination, and then also timeliness. What was problematic at the time was that the humanitarian aid community itself denied that there was any need for evaluation. They didn't want it. They did good, so nobody should question whether the money was well spent or not well spent. The issue was doing good. And the problem really became, how do you negotiate with people who don't actually want to be evaluated, even though the majority of their money for humanitarian assistance came from government, not from their own fundraising? Eventually, we kind of had this almost horizontal version of evaluation. Over here was public accountability, and over here was technical competence. And with the establishment of a whole series of organizations after the Rwandan crisis, including ALNEP, the humanitarian aid community said, well, we will accept evaluations to this side, about our technical capacity. But they never really wanted the question of whether it was appropriate to be addressed, because that actually protect the existence of their own organizations. And so my kind of experience was during the late 90s, there was a build-up in capacity in all of the humanitarian organizations, the UN and the Red Cross, the leading international NGOs, to bring some level of evaluation in-house. But that level of evaluation was largely talking about technical capacity or value for money against parallel market values, rather than asking the basic question, is it appropriate to have humanitarian assistance in this situation? And the problem for me was compounded enormously by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the rise of the first complex emergency in Bosnia. Before that, the humanitarian assistance professionalism had been largely focused on low impact, slow impact disasters, especially drought, especially African drought, the famous 73 to 75 famine and the 84 to 86 famine. And it had produced a whole series of workers that cored their efforts around nutrition. And that necessarily meant there were a whole series of senior female managers who knew how to run large-scale feeding camps. That all disappeared as we hit complex emergencies. Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Central African Republic, it just rolls on. But the problem was, not least because the evaluations were technically focused, there was a tendency for all aid agencies, led by WFP, I would have to say, that they would design interventions that were really toys for the boys. And so again, the management structure changed back to be very male. The interventions were very technical, and the political questions in general were not asked. I think that kind of reflects where we are now.
So in that process, where did you see yourself being fit in? Where did you see yourself and how you got into the evaluation process?
I got in by accident. One, I was a field scientist, so I was used to doing intensive 12, 14-day missions, maybe 21 days. Two is I'd started work in geography in and around the natural hazard paradigm, initially with soil erosion, and then with, I suppose, drought. But back in 1976 in Nature, I was lead author of a major paper arguing basically that natural disasters weren't natural. They only happened to the poorest people in the poorest place. And in general, that is still true. But it's also true of war. That it generally is a situation in terms of complex emergencies that we're dealing with poor people in poor places that are at war for agendas largely driven by competing political philosophies, but also significantly driven by the impact of Western neoliberalism, market conditions, on people who really have subsistence lives. And that's where we are today, still the same place.
So what have been the biggest lessons that you've learned, do you think, over the years of conducting evaluations?
Well, the first one is, because you always get your knuckles wrapped if you do it, is in an evaluation, you cannot really question the political decision to intervene. You can evaluate everything else, but that political decision to intervene is what is not allowed in an evaluation. So I suppose the first thing you learn is how can you criticize that political decision without appearing to do so? And so you have to build a substantial base of evidence. It's evidence, evidence, evidence to say, why didn't you reverse that decision? So I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned. The second biggest thing I've learned is really that in order to deliver humanitarian assistance, you have to create a humanitarian space in which aid workers can actually undertake their legitimate work. Unfortunately, that humanitarian space is largely built by the military. The minute that you have the military involved, then any notion that this humanitarian assistance is neutral or impartial is just impossible to uphold. You can't do it. So in other words, in order to deliver humanitarian space, the humanitarian agencies are basically conceding that their own principles don't really amount to very much. And that's the problem.
And so, another question then: what advice would you give to any new evaluator today entering the field?
Many years ago in Dar es Salaam, I worked with a political scientist called Lionel Cliff. And we tried to teach medical students who had to go out for a month's activity in rural areas. And they didn't want to do this at all. They wanted to be Harley Street consultants. And in an easy division of labour, because Lionel was more senior and older than me, he said, well, Phil, you just do the quantitative work, and I'll do the qualitative. And so when it came to Lionel to teach the qualitative work, he held out his hand to a student and said, imagine I am the leader of this socialist Ujamaa village. Shake my hand. So the student did. And then he said, Lionel said to the student, what did you learn from that? The student said nothing. And Lionel said, let me tell you, if I was a real socialist worker, I would have calluses on my hands. That's what you're testing when you shake hands with the head man. And I also learned enormously from a person into agroforestry, small trees on farms, who used to get out of the 4x4 wherever we went. And all he would do is walk backwards and look at the landscape, because the landscape told the story of the people's lives and struggles. The bottom line advice is read everything you can, but don't believe a word of it. Tread extremely carefully if you are dealing with issues around individual health projects, particularly if it concerns any level of reproductive health associated with gender, and the whole implication that we have in these complex emergencies that rape is an acceptable form of warfare. After that, smile. This is not a kind of exam evaluation. It is basically one simple question which says, are the claims that you make actually true? And as long as you can keep in your head that simple question, are these claims actually true? Then you will be a good evaluator.
And so finally, can you share with us what was your most memorable evaluation and why?
Well, there are many memorable evaluations.
Sure.
I think the ones that come to mind are obviously the Intergovernmental Rwanda evaluation, which was the first massive one that was done still with the old questions around sustainability, but that was important. And I think the Danish-led first international survey, which if I remember correctly was 11 countries, and then but that was 1999, and then the big Dutch evaluation to 2005, again global. They were important basically in establishing that the central problem of humanitarian delivery is coordination, and that has never ever been solved. If you were to take the Asian tsunami, nobody worried about coordination in the Asian tsunami because all actors across the UN, across the international NGOs, had more than sufficient money for their own needs. Coordination only becomes an issue when money is scarce. And what you have to do is look at the annual levels of appeal from the UN system and what the level of shortfall is. In general, requests for food are fulfilled about 60% of the time. Requests for shelter are fulfilled about 35, 36% of the time. Requests for water, sanitation, the essential points of reproduction are fulfilled less than 20% of the time. So it's against that background of needs not being met that you're doing these evaluations all the time. And you have to realize how political it all is. This 2015 and 16 is a year in which we'll see some 80% of the humanitarian budget spent in Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, essentially spent by Western Christian agencies in a Muslim world on things that are a direct consequence of what the Western world has generated as war. How that can still be called humanitarian is sometimes beyond me.
Based on all of the challenges and the political nature, as you've talked about, of evaluations, do you think they're still important?
Absolutely critical, but for a reason that I've only really thought through in the last 5 years. On the bottom line at the present moment, humanitarian assistance, which went from roughly $500 million a year in 1990 to $60 billion last year, which as far as I can work out is a 120-fold increase in the volume of humanitarian assistance. And why 1990 is important is because that causes the collapse of the Soviet Union, the start of complex emergencies, the dominance of complex emergencies of a natural hazard in humanitarian delivery. But what essentially we're seeing is that humanitarian assistance is now used as a substitute for failed or non-existent foreign policy by the West in general. We have very little idea about what emerges from the Muslim world, except to know there's some big capital projects that are financed there. So all we can do is record what's happening at the moment from the Western world. And that seems to me substitute humanitarian aid for any level of diplomacy.
In that sense, how do you see the future of humanitarianism, humanitarian affairs?
Well, I think it's kind of, certainly sitting in the UK, rather like being asked about the future of the NHS. I believe in the value, and I believe in the Hippocratic oath that doctors, nurses, other paramedics take, that they do wish to serve, and that there is a significant issue there relating vulnerability and therefore the need for humanitarian assistance to the lack of development. I don't see much of a future with every single community producing its own disaster reduction plan. It would be like requiring a hospital in every single village. It's not a sensible way to organize. But I think the humanitarian value of shared humanism, whatever your religious background, whatever your racial background, whatever your gender, is so important that as a moral question, it will never go away. Theresa May famously said at the Conservative Party conference, what does it mean to be an international citizen? And came to her own conclusion that it didn't mean anything. What it means to be an international citizen is simply that you value everybody else's life as much as your own. And at that point, you start humanitarian aid.
Phil, thank you very much for your time
Pleasure.
and talking with you. Thank you.